stuff in a quantitative way. And yeah, we're gonna record this session, Sarah. Thanks for reminding me. So super excited about the panelists today and the talks. And so we're gonna, each person's gonna talk for 10 minutes. Then we'll have 5 minutes afterward for Q&A after each presentation. And then we'll hit an hour. So Sarah, why don't you take it away?
Great, thanks so much, Nate, for organizing. I'll try and keep well to time as well. So this talk is called Work to Vec, using language models to understand wage premia. And what it does is it uses online job postings and combining that with language models to understand how various different attributes affect wages. And so this is really a fundamental question. For decades, researchers have tried to analyze and decompose what affects wages into different elements. But a major limitation has really been data. Survey data is often limited or gets more expensive as you collect it more frequently or you ask more and more questions. And administrative data in the United States, at least, doesn't necessarily have occupation on most records. And so that makes our understanding of what affects wages pretty weak as a result of not having very, very high frequency or granular data sources. But as a result of the growth of the internet and our existence online, we have all these new data sources that are really digital traces of employers' demands for what they're looking for in workers in the form of online job postings. And so the fundamental question that I ask in this paper is, do words matter? That is, can we understand the relationship between the text of a job posting and the salary of a job posting? Is there a relationship there? And if it's there, then what does it tell us about the value attributable to various different characteristics? So the first part of the paper, I'll go ahead and predict salary from the text of job postings, and I'll talk a little bit about the data that I use to do that. And then I compare that with a lot of other valuable benchmarks, including occupation fixed effects or occupation by location fixed effects, all which are currently our benchmarks to understand the relationship between wages and what workers do. And then in the second part of the paper, I use those models to be able to understand the value attributable to different activities, skills, titles, locations, and other characteristics of jobs. So in order to do this, I assemble a data set with over 1 million postings from 2019. This is going to be combined burning glass technology postings, which some of you might be familiar with a second data source called Greenwich HR. These are postings that come from a variety of different contexts. One of them, for example, is a clinical research coordinator too, here at Stanford University's Department of Pediatrics, but they also come from all sorts of places, including an aircraft maintenance technician at the UPS in Anchorage, Alaska, and they span levels as well. So, for example, there's an entry-level server at Boiling Point, one of my sister's favorite restaurants near my hometown. And so this data set has a variety of postings that allow us to look across occupations. The key attribute in this data is really that I have recruiter inputted salary bands. These come from a firm data vendor called Greenwich HR. Approximately 80% of these job postings have salaries associated with them. And I'll talk a little bit about where these come from. So a lot of different job board user interfaces ask recruiters to input salaries. This is a screenshot from Indeed.com, which asks workers what's the pay, or sorry, asks recruiters what's the pay, and has a recruiter input in either the exact pay for the role or a range or starting at or up to. In this case, you can see the prompt says, tell job seekers to pay and receive up to 2 times more applications. So that's incentivized, but not necessarily mandatory. In a second screenshot on the right, you can see from LinkedIn.com, where a recruiter is being asked to either input their own salary or show an estimate from LinkedIn members with the same job title at the same firm in the same metropolitan statistical area. So a lot of different job board user interfaces are asking recruiters to input salaries. There's also evidence of this kind of information on the job seeker side. So if you look at this screenshot from Career Builder that I took, you can filter a role or the roles that you see based on the different levels of salary being offered. And so what I do with these recruiter inputted salaries is develop a model to predict salaries. In line with the new literature on foundation models, there's this huge paradigm shift in AI where these large language models are developed, and those models are used to be able to, you take that model and you fine tune it for a particular task. And so what I do is I fine tune one of these models called a BERT model for the task of salary prediction. And then I evaluate that particular model on out of sample postings. And so take around 800,000 job postings, train the model, and then predict on these 200,000 postings that are considered out of sample, and then compare to these alternative baselines. The measure I'm going to focus on today is how much variation the model explains, a measure of R squared. I could show you a measure of root mean squared error or prediction error, but I find R squared or the coefficient of variation relatively explainable because of the fact that if you think about it, like the value is going to be somewhere between 0 and 1, or and that helps you understand the amount of variation that the words explain. And so what I find is that this BERT-based model that I developed explains 83% of the variation in salaries. And that's in line with a lot of the other literature that uses BERT for economics applications. Compared to occupation fixed effects, occupation fixed effects explain almost 60% of the variation in salaries. These are 6-digit occupation fixed effects coded by Burning Glass. If you look, we know that location matters. And so if you look at occupation by location, I use MSA as a measure of location in this paper. What you can see is that that explains just under 70% of the variation in salaries. And then you can go even further and look at skill groups. So Burning Glass Technologies codes jobs with skills, and those can be put into broader skill groups, of which there are 28, or more narrow skill groups, of which there are 648. And so what you can see is that the BERT-based model exceeds the performance of both these narrow skill groups and these broad skill groups. And so the comparison I would really want you to think about here is if you had to ask a worker, or rather their manager, of whether or not they need these 648 different skills, that would be a huge burden. However, like you can get that same level of information through the text of the job posting. And so now we have a model that explains 83% of the variation in salaries. What does it say matters with respect to a job postings? And so what I'm going to show you next is which tokens or words play an outsized role. The attribution method I use in this context is called integrated gradients. I won't get a lot of time to talk about that, but hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that this makes a lot of sense. So here I'm showing you select activity related words in job postings that have positive and negative valuations. So the word manages, for example, is associated with a positive evaluation in the job posting, and the word clean, for example, is associated with a relatively negative value in the job posting. And so these all have different magnitudes. So the inclusion of a word, I'm going to give you this specific example of evaluate in a posting is on average associated with a 0.0002% increase in salary. That might seem small, and it is, but that's the effect of a given word in a posting conditional on all the other words around it. And so you can see that it's kind of interesting how well or how different words affect the relationship between the salary of the relationship with the salary of the posting. I'll show you one more with respect to technology skills. You can see here that most technology skills have positive effects on salary. So you can see Python, SQL, all skills that I've used in this in this project. Microsoft Word, on the other hand, has a bit of a negative effect, and I think that that's something we know about the Microsoft Office suite. And so the next step is really to look at the various words in postings a little bit more closely. You might say Microsoft is not just a technology skill, but also a firm name. And so right now I'm taking this set of postings and coding it with firm names, functions, locations, activities, all sorts of different things in order to try and understand the relationship between the words and their relative effects on salaries and postings. And so that's just a taste. I think my time's close to up. Is that right, Nate? Great. And happy to take questions.
Carly, go ahead.
Oh, I actually didn't have a question, but I can. I unmuted myself to clap. But,
got it.
Thank you. Yeah.
I do have a question, which is, Sarah, I was wondering if you could explain, and I apologize if I missed this. So my understanding was oftentimes in these postings, the bands around the wage or the salary estimates can be quite large. Could you explain a little bit more how the model is predicting those bands?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So right now I'm using the median of the distribution, and I agree that when oftentimes they're posted, they're relatively large. Doing some more robustness work with respect to the size of the different bands. So clearly the bands will differ based on the occupation that it's for, but also the different websites have incentivized different bands differently. So this makes it's a great question. It's definitely something that I'm working a little bit more at.
Dee?
Thanks, Nate and Sarah. So I have two questions. First is what do you think this individual words add to occupation, location, skill, etc.? Because it seems that a lot of the words that you identify actually also describe work tasks or abilities there. So is there a way you could kind of automatically identify among the words that's most predictable but pay in either directions, what are they about, and is there a pattern there? And my second question is, I just wonder why, just for that figure comparing birds and all the other models, I was wondering whether at some point you also put firm as one important predictor.
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me answer the second one first. So this particular data set only has a little bit more than 1 million observations. And so adding firm fixed effects, I think, is relatively challenging because the sample size just isn't necessarily there. But I think that in the future, using other data sets, what I'm trying to do is actually look at the relationship between the activities being asked for in a given role and the firm fixed effects. So I know Jason's done a lot of work on firm fixed effects, and I too find them really interesting. I think that potentially some of the relationship between a firm fixed effect and can be picked up by some of the activities that are being articulated in the role or the skills that are being required for the role. So that's the firm fixed effect question. I think that you're right that a lot of the words relate to, and I don't know if this was indirect or direct, like the discussion of ONET's detailed work activities or skills or things like that. Right now, one of the reasons for this project is that ONET doesn't allow any differences between workers within an occupation. And so that really limits our understanding between what workers do in different contexts and their mobility, for example. And so that was definitely part of the impetus behind this project. In this project, I don't take a posting, tag it with ONET detailed work activities, for example, and then predict based on that. But in other work using syllabus data, we've taken syllabi, tag that with detailed work activities, and then use that to predict, for example, cohort level earnings at a university. And so I think that these two approaches are somewhat complementary, using ONA as a middle ground to be able to make these things more interpretable. I think the value of words is, or some of these words, is that they are inherently interpretable, and so could lead to some other applications like automated resume generation and things like that.
Am I right in thinking that like each, the chart you showed showing the payoff to different words, like, is this model basically assuming there aren't sort of interactions between words? Like, have you thought at all about, like, could you look at trigrams or something?
Yeah. So the way integrated gradients works is it's based on interactions between the words in a phrase, right? So actually, it's meant to pick up on those relationships, at least within a given line of a posting, as maybe not necessarily the first word versus the last word. Large language models are relatively bad at that, but yeah, you've motioned in absolutely the right direction, Nate, which is this is tokens. Next step is, I've already worked on words, and then bigrams and trigrams I think are a natural extension. The thing is that it starts to get a little bit unwieldy, but I think that it makes sense as a way to interpret things.
Well, super interesting, Sarah. Thank you. Allison has a question in the chat, but maybe you could respond to her there. I'm sorry, I just saw it. So we have got to switch to Peter now. Take it away, Peter.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Sarah, for that great presentation. I think that the presentations today really do set up well what I'm about to talk about. I think I want to, can you see my slides now? Yes, okay, great.
Good.
So this is joint work with Stephen Meisenbacher, and essentially to first position this work and describe what it is and why we're doing it is to solve a very specific problem that I as a researcher faced. The diamond in the rough problem, or the needle in the haystack problem, where there's just a ton of data, and as a researcher I may have a hypothesis, a speculative hypothesis, some sort of inductive desire to dig into text data and see what's there. Okay, so it began really with just like Sarah was talking about, the burning glass document corpus of job advertisements, and I really wanted to know, is a job remote or not? Okay, and to do that, basically began working with Stephen, who's a computer scientist, and over the course of the last year, we've developed a number of software tools that we're calling context rule-assisted machine learning. We hope to launch it on GitHub at some point this summer. We just finished our draft before the conference last week, and it's up on Vox. We would love to have feedback on this. It's pretty preliminary, but it's really positioning a solution for a domain user like me, who is not necessarily a computer scientist. And I've begun my data science certificate program at Loyola, but I haven't finished it yet. And I'm probably not going to be the expert for the questions that may come about machine learning. Stephen couldn't make it today, but any feedback we're really looking forward to hear. I just want to give you kind of a sense of why and motivate why we want to do this. And really on the left-hand side of the picture here, this is a concept map. I want to walk you through some of the challenges that we see with the current set of tools that are available to domain researchers who are dealing with large amounts of text. The first problem is information overload. Even if you want to go in and search for your keywords, you're going to be buried by the size and the scale of these. We're looking at two particular problems in that area. One I call sifting. I want to sift through and I want to find examples because I want to do inductive or abductive kind of reasoning about, well, what is it that really makes a job a work from home job? If it has this particular text pattern, I as a human do want to know what is it that's telling me that this is really a job that has this characteristic. Now, machine learning and all other tools have a number of criteria on which they're valuable. And for me as a human and as a researcher, like I really want explainability. I want to know and trust my data before I start running it into the models. The next challenge I face is, let's suppose I have a great way of characterizing or classifying some data. I can tell you after reading thousands of examples exactly what text in job ads makes a job remote or not. Now I can do that as a human only for the number of cases I can see in a day. I'm limited by my bandwidth. But machine tools and computer tools can help scale a classification scheme if there's a tool. So our solution for these, and on the right-hand side, we have our solutions. I'm going to basically be writing rules. Okay, I'm going to be examining the data, and I'm going to be extrapolating rules that I wrote onto the, it's really excerpts of the documents, and then building a training data set that a machine learning model can be trained on, okay? To think like me about whether or not a job advertisement says that it's remote. Now, you can do this for any number of characteristics, and I really want to emphasize the flexibility here that we're desiring to put into the design of this type of solution. The explainability I mentioned a little bit before, common complaint is we don't understand with some of the methods necessarily how we go from inputs to outputs. It's kind of a black box, and the emphasis on explanation is post hoc explanation. So after running the model, we can look back and see, well, why is it necessarily that? And I think we see some of that in for example, the last presentation. That is, just the way things are done. But as a different perspective I'm coming from, I want to really know, and I want to be a human in the loop. Essentially, I want to steer the learning. I want to tell the machine to think like me, okay? And then I can explain it to you, and I can also produce the rule file that generated the data set, and that is a complete chain of transparency. Next part about making meaning of data, we want to produce novel training data sets essentially that can be used in machine learning. I'm showing you this screen right now. This is actually a screen I'm connected by Microsoft Remote Desktop to a computer in my living room. It's not a supercomputer, okay? And on this screen, I'm showing you essentially a pretty good desktop that has CRaML on it. This is the tool. I'm showing it to you right now. I can go in and I can extract chunks of text based on keywords I input. And I'm here looking at the n-grams, or I'm looking at 5-word chunks of text, and I can classify these. If one of these, for example, this particular project is related to finding no poach. So if you were at the antitrust session just before this, I'm finding no poach clauses in public document contracts, okay? And these are all of the extracted chunks of text that contain some of the keywords that I'm interested in. So the keywords I'm interested in, solicit, employ, hire, recruit. Behind the scenes here, this is all Python. And the great thing from a researcher's perspective is that it's all essentially saved as CSV files on the back end. So I can just open up a spreadsheet and dig into it like this file, or the rules that I'm writing. What is a no poach agreement if it has the phrase shall not hire, shall not employ, that kind of thing. Let me jump back over to the presentation now. And the slides. I kind of have gotten through the challenges, and I want to describe the process kind of from top to bottom. You begin with a large document corpus, okay? And how you acquire this is really the I think core limitation of this method, because currently a lot of the data sets that people use are proprietary and unable to be accessed. So for this particular project I'm working on right now, the goal is to make public hundreds of thousands of dollars of contracts that are between public sector entities and private entities, and looking for no poach clauses in them. So I'm just showing you this particular project has about 600,000 PDF files right now that have been converted to text, and we're extracting from there. Next, we get chunks of text from keywords. And here's the thing, often with document classification techniques, we're dealing with structured data that is at the level of the document, and the PDFs here can be hundreds of pages of long, but the thing that tells me that it's got a no poach clause is about a sentence or two, okay? So I, as an expert, can define the size of the chunk around my keywords that I want to extract. So I want to get the full sentence around my keywords, like hire, employ, solicit, okay? Then I can learn and review the patterns of the most frequently appearing patterns in the text. I can create rules that classify this is or is not a no poach clause or any other number of characteristics. I can extrapolate and build myself a training data set. And then a machine learning model can be trained on the data set. At the end of the day, this comes back up to the document level. Okay, we've extracted chunks of text from the document level, determined whether or not they contain a particular, clause. And now we say that document does or does not have that characteristic. So this is very helpful for looking at job postings and saying whether or not they offer work from home. It's helpful for looking at, whether or not the job mentions you, that the job is unionized, you need a professional license, all sorts of other characteristics that I'm definitely interested in, you can extract. So this is human in loop. And Nate, can you let me know what time I should stop?
Yeah, you've got like 1 more minute.
Perfect. Okay. So at the end of the day, you get a tabular data set with zeros and ones for each of the features that you want to know about whether or not the document contains. Typically, AI assumes that there are rules out there that can be expressed by the machine, and the machine goes out and finds them. And with unsupervised methods, including topic modeling, which we'll hear more about soon, it assumes that you're interested in an unbiased view. Now, the interesting thing here is that you and I may have a difference of opinion about what makes a job work from home, or you may be interested in hybrid jobs, and I'm interested only in jobs that are purely remote. Well, we can construct our rules differently, and on the same data set, we can produce these training data sets and so forth. If the underlying data can be public, we can have a much more open, transparent, replicable type of ecosystem. So I'm looking forward to working with people. I'm glad to see that Patricia Tabarani is here, and we are planning to work together this summer on some more work with CRaML and job postings, trying to figure out a lot of different features of job postings. This is kind of the messy map that we made for the whole process, but it does involve a human iterating back and forth with text until you can express essentially as a human to a machine, these are the rules that I want you to follow when you go out and think about whether or not a piece of text has a particular characteristic or not. So with that,
I just want to make sure you've got time for questions. Yeah, sorry, you're wrapping up anyway.
Perfect.
Awesome. Questions for Peter on this super inspiring tool. I can kick it off by just saying I love the focus on transparency and replicability here, which I think has really been something where text methods have had challenges, both from a kind of like, does the researcher fully understand it, to like, could somebody else reading the paper and looking at the replication code or whatever come to a similar conclusion? So I think that's awesome that that's front and center in what you're thinking about.
Yes, and go ahead, Carly. The one thing I'll say is that the paper I did on work from home, I can't make much of that because it relies on proprietary data public. But I'm doing this no poach project specifically because it's working with public text, and at the end of the day, actually, you can see right here that I'm uploading documents. I'm not going to show it to you anyway, to the document cloud, and hundreds of thousands of state contracts will be up there. There's a public corpus that people can look at, and you can trace back all of it, rerun your own analysis, do whatever. Carly, yeah.
Awesome. Maybe you guys could both ask your questions, and then Jason could respond at once.
Absolutely. And thank you, Peter, so much. This is really exciting, and I can't wait to read the paper and learn more about it. And so this is just a sort of a quest for more information. I also, with Nate, really like the transparency and the capacity of the researcher to, be like set the rules. I think the part that I was a little bit confused of was it was very clear to me kind of the role the researcher was playing in delineating the training data set, but less so at the stage where there was like machine learning in determining whether or not a text has that characteristic. Could you say a little bit more about the role the researcher is playing in setting the rules for that stage in the workflow?
Great. And Sarah?
Yeah, I was just sort of wondering, Peter, if you had any thoughts on how many examples you need to get one of these things to work. I know I was looking at Google's entity extraction sort of characteristic, and they've said that they want minimum, or like in order to work best, you require 200 annotated examples of each class. And so just wondering about like class imbalances and in some of these spaces, and then like how well does it work with how few examples?
Yeah, thank you. On Box, I put up my work from home paper, and I put up this draft. So Some of the answers might be in there, but for the role of the researcher in setting the rules for machine learning, essentially the researcher can set the parameters and also can choose between different models such as naive Bayes and random forest. And we're looking forward to doing some further extensions of this work with embeddings. I should also say thank you to the Economic Security Project for funding and supporting this initiative. In terms of how many examples are needed, I'm writing regular expressions that I think annotate a bunch of chunks correctly, and I'm doing then an extrapolation onto about 200,000 examples, so I can sample from the text corpus. And I don't need the 25 gigabyte text corpus, though. I only need, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of examples, which can be run on a desktop and then scaled back to the millions of observations that are out there, or many more observations, than any person could look at.
Awesome, thanks, Peter. Carly, floor is yours.
Okay, great. All right, let me get this started. Right. Can you guys all see it in full view, or
we've got the presenter view, not the slides?
Oh, okay. Sorry. I've only had 3 years to learn how to do this. Oh, still? There we go.
Great.
Great. All right. So thanks to Nate for running this, for everyone for being here. This is going to shift gears a little bit in that the paper I'm presenting here is a little bit more applied as opposed to innovations in text methods, but I'm really eager to get all your results. This is a project that Nate and I have been working on for a while, and we're actually at a place that I think it's fair to say we're a little stuck. We've been sitting on a hard R&R for a little while, and we would really appreciate your thoughts on, what you found interesting, what doesn't work, and any ideas you have for additional data that we might be missing, which is kind of where we're stuck. Anyway, so our presentation is on transformation and managerial ideologies between 1935 and 2005 using text analysis to identify them. So let me just move forward. So there's been a great deal of research that has discussed kind of the fundamental transformation in what are termed managerial ideologies over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. So specifically, there's this transition from a post-war firm to the more contemporary kind of post-1970s firm that has been described as a shift from bureaucratic managerial control to a new deal at work, which is associated with normative control. Essentially, kind of the new deal at work is supposedly one in which, at least in theory, organizations control their workers through a focus on flexibility, teamwork, collaboration, and employee empowerment. So many scholars have already noted that the rise of this new 21st century firm is sort of riven with contradictions. So on the one hand, you have flexible firms that kind of in the model of GE are encouraged to treat their employees essentially as costs to be minimized or restructured, right? And on the other hand, there's this language of valuing employees as team and community members that was also a fundamental part of this transition. So Paul DiMaggio has put it, the 21st century firm both seems to require kind of a meaningful corporate culture with intensely shared values, and at the same time that the firm acts as a nexus of contracts among shareholders that reduces employee costs. Milkman and others have referred to this kind of cost orientation versus asset orientation to employees as the difference between taking the high road or the low road to the creation of the 21st century firm. So our research question in this paper was, which firms took the high road approach and which took the low? And as I've mentioned, a great deal of research has kind of explored this question in the transformation and managerial ideologies from a macro level. So studies have examined, how economic downturns, technological change, regulatory loosening, and diminishing returns to old management practices prompted firms to find a new way of organizing work. And then on the other hand, you have kind of at the micro level, sociologists of work and others have looked within a few cases or within organizations to see how specific firm characteristics like union strength or managerial interactions structure kind of the uptake of these new ideas behind the kind of like New Deal at work. To date, however, there's been decidedly less research that predicts kind of the uptake of new managerial ideologies across firms. So which firms picked up which parts of these new managerial ideologies. So we know much less about which firms adopt ideologies and when. So in this paper, Nate and I build on theories of organizational identity to posit hypotheses about where and when we should see firms adopt new ideologies. So kind of first, briefly, there's a great deal of research that shows the difficulty of organizational change, particularly with respect to employment relations. This literature suggests that managerial ideologies at the firm level should exhibit, a pretty strong degree of continuity. Firms that treat their employees as assets in an earlier time period should continue to do so in the new world of work, and those that treated their employees as costs in earlier time periods should likewise continue to do so. At the same time, there's relational approaches to organizational identities that suggest that firms' identities kind of shift alongside the stakeholders to whom they're oriented. So for firms whose identities are oriented to their employees, changes in the composition of who they're employing will shift the firm's identities. So building on these literatures, we therefore predict that firms that treat their employees as assets will maintain that identity over time. At the same time, as the composition of those firms change, they're going to shift which workers they're oriented towards. So part of the reason that it has been difficult to examine firm level changes in managerial ideologies is the lack of data. To track managerial ideologies, research has tended to draw either on like a single overarching resource, like a management or human resource journals, or they draw on a sample of just a few cases. Nate and I were really excited about the potential for digitized archives and computational analysis to help track firm level managerial ideologies over time. So we draw on a data set of corporate annual reports compiled by Harvard Business School Library and digitized by ProQuest between 1935 and 2005. Eons ago in graduate school, Nate and I spent a long time processing these records, harmonizing them over the years and identifying companies over time. We have data on roughly 800 companies, including data about their financial performance and industry over this period. And we merged this with industry level data on workforce characteristics. And then for a subset, we were able to merge with EO1 data on firm level workforce data. To give you a sense of our workflow, what our project involved is that we basically took these corporate annual reports, which we have digitized in text form, and we extracted the narrative portion of the annual report, so separating it from the financial summary. We then break the report into paragraphs and select those paragraphs that have to do with employment. We used a machine learning algorithm for that. We then process the text and use structural topic models to identify managerial ideologies. And what we test our hypotheses, what we're ending up predicting is, who takes the high road and who takes the low road in these 21st century managerial ideologies, which we identify using structural topic models. And then we predict, which firms are taking up these ideologies based on these controls we have about the firm. So we have a measure of ideologies that the firm has held in the past, measures of the workforce composition, measures of firm performance. We have firm, which is largely revenue. And then we have some other text-based measures using sentiment analysis on the reports, as well as some text-based measures that identify like firm crises, like litigation events. And finally, controls for quality of the reports. Okay, so to get to our results, we begin by identifying managerial topics in text. And here we have this cost versus asset breakdown. Across the top row, we have those that are more focused in cost. So going from left to right here, the The first topic involves discussing labor and wage costs. The second involves discussing union costs, including strikes, negotiating contracts, et cetera. And then over here, we see discussion of employee restructuring costs and this cost associated with severance payments. Along the bottom row, we see different kind of eras of talking about employees in terms of assets. You have this kind of paternalistic language of employee loyalty to the firm. You have this era of firms talking about actually their sort of commitment to their employees through training programs, usually that are about kind of moving employees up the corporate ladder. And then over here, you have organizational culture. So topics that talk about their employees as team, as part of a team or part of a community.
1 minute, Carly.
Oh, okay, sorry. All right, so basically these topics change over time in the way that you would expect. And I'm just gonna go quickly to the findings. So what predicts change? Basically what we find is that there is this consistency in terms of asset orientation to employees over time. So firms that in the past had, focused on, in the post-war era, on training their blue collar employees become the firms that talk about organizational culture largely for their white collar employees. And firms that talk about their employees in terms of costs during the post-war era are less likely to adopt this organizational approach to management in the future. We also find this transition that firms that increase their white-collar employment are more likely to adopt this attitude of organizational culture. We don't have time to talk about this, but Nate and I kind of do a qualitative portion of the paper where we dig into those firms that make this transition. And what we see is essentially kind of in the post-war era, asset-oriented firms are focused on their blue collar workforce and kind of profiling that. And then over time, begin shifting to their college educated workforce. So plenty of limitations as well as implications we could talk about, but I'm pretty sure I'm over time, so I will stop there.
Awesome. Thanks, Carly. It's a lucky thing this is a historical project. So, no time sensitive thing to get it out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Questions for Carly?
I can start if no one else has them. I think one question I had was how were the 800 firms selected, or why do those particular ones exist in the archive? Just curious more than anything.
Yeah, absolutely. That's sort of a limitation of, well, that's one of the limitations of the study is there isn't a real systematic. So these are reports that were donated to Harvard Business School Library. And Nate and I have done some work to try to compare the set of reports they have to what we can, to generally public firms in this time period. And, there's some similarities. They obviously differ in many ways. We have a lot of manufacturing firms, but it's definitely a convenient sample.
Makes sense.
Hi, Jen.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Fantastic paper, by the way. I think I could imagine that you probably spent a ton of time sorting through these documents. So I noticed that you included union cost sort of as a way of identifying firms that talk about employees as cost. I wonder, especially, in the last 20, 30 years, I wonder if lack of the mention of union is also a signal that companies are not necessarily thinking of workers as assets. So they're not even, the unions are not even present in the company, and that they're not even talking about it because there is no sort of organizing efforts, or that there is no union to begin with at the company, right? So I wonder if you kind of thought about that.
Great. And maybe, Peter, you could toss your question in too, and then Carly can answer both quickly.
Just, is there anything specific you're looking for feedback on? I think would be the shorter question. Thanks.
Yeah, so for the union, we've absolutely thought about that. Our hypothesis was that kind of, as you saw the decline of this sort of focus on union costs, that it would be those firms that had these conflictual relationships with the unions in the 50s, 60s, 70s that would be most likely to adopt kind of the restructuring orientation in the kind of 1990s. That wasn't exactly the case. There's a correlation there, but it's not significant. But that was sort of our thought. But that's absolutely the case. What we see is those firms that, you know, were in these conflictual relationships with their unions and talking about that in their annual report were not likely to adopt this kind of organizational culture rhetoric that became really popular in like the 80s and 90s. For Peter, I guess, I mean, I'm really eager to look into your a method and see if that would help us. I mean, basically part of the thing we're stuck on is that we have reviewers who want kind of more specificity on the mechanism of why it's the case. There's this continuity between like training firms in kind of post-war period and culture firms in 21st century. And we're so limited in the kinds of like firm level controls that we have. Like anyone who had thoughts on data sets that exist, that's sort of where as one thing that we're looking at doing right now.
Great, thanks so much, Carly. And we're perfectly on time for Jason to close us out.
Awesome, yeah, thanks so much. Let me share my screen. So admittedly, I'm slightly under the weather, so I'm gonna try and get through this as best as I can. I will say though, typically I have 90 minutes to present this, so I'm going to try and distill as much as I can in just 10 minutes. But this is my job market paper from this past year. It's called Show Me the Amenity for Higher Paying Firms that are all around. You'll see a lot of the themes that have been talked about through the other three papers sort of evoked in this paper. And the main research question this paper tries to answer is, do amenities, these sort of aspects of work that go beyond wages, do they improve or do they actually worsen with the wage or the pay that a firm offers? And there are two competing forces really at play that can lead to either them moving together or moving inversely. So you can get this positive relationship between wages and amenities, sort of anything that's not the wage at a firm. You can think about working conditions or interpersonal relationships with their coworkers. You could get a positive relationship between those two if firms can compensate workers using either of those two things. They can invest in working conditions or they can pay you a higher wage. And if workers value both of those, right, if these are both normal goods, then higher productivity firms can afford to offer more of both. They can invest in wages and invest in working conditions or building, a better culture at the firm. Inversely though, you could get this negative relationship where in fact, higher paying firms have worse amenities and they have worse conditions at the firm. And you can get this relationship because if workers do value amenities, then firms, knowing that, could offer you lower wages in lieu of better amenities, sort of traditional compensating differential framework. And so if there is this positive relationship, that would mean that higher paying workers are even better off than we think they are, right? They're also getting better amenities. And so that would tip the scales even further towards being more inequality, and thus wages alone would understate inequality across employers. Inversely, if we have this negative relationship, we get the opposite, right? That means there's these equalizing differences, and it turns out that high paid workers have really bad working conditions. And so inequality is actually overstated by wages. And so using textual data and looking at job amenities, I'm going to try and see, do amenities in fact improve or worsen with wages? And so how I'll do that, the empirical approach I'll take is so these two-way fixed effects and these canonical models, where I'll be able to estimate firm-specific differences or firm premia in both wages and in job amenities, right? And these job amenities, which I'll talk about extensively in the next couple of slides, are going to try to be captured through machine learning with text. And really the core or the key value added of this paper is they're going to be hard to measure aspects of work. We're talking things about quality of one's coworkers, about how much autonomy workers are given on the job, how much stress do they feel in their jobs. And the data that will allow me to answer this question is a panel where I observe the same worker working for multiple employers. We'll all observe their wages at those employers as well as their amenities at these employers. So both of these I'll observe that same person working at different firms. And the contribution really is that this is, I believe, the best to my knowledge, the first paper that can empirically measure amenities across employers, right? It's not going to rely on this identifying assumption where, if I take a lower paying job, I must be getting some better amenities. I won't be making any assumptions like that. I'll be able to empirically directly measure, the quality of working conditions or interpersonal relationships or human capital investments at different employers from this data. And so the innovation from this paper is measuring how much amenity value workers are going to get from their employer from working at this job. And there's going to be 3 key empirical inputs, which if I can get each of these 3 things, which I systematically do in the paper, then I can get the value workers get from the non-wage aspects of work, right? Essentially what I'll do is start with job satisfaction, right? This idea that job satisfaction is sort of the only measure that can reflect the entire panoply of job characteristics, that workers take everything that they experience and that gets morphed into this output, which is satisfaction with their job. So I'm going to start with job satisfaction and ask, are higher paying firms higher satisfaction or lower satisfaction firms? Once I get that premium, which is going to be in some measure of stars, which matters within my data set, I'll need to figure out how much the workers actually value this job satisfaction premium. So there, I'll get a conversion from stars into dollars. So how much value do workers get from these improved job satisfaction? And the third, and the thing I'll focus on most in the next 5 or 6 minutes, is these amenities. What share of that satisfaction premium can I attribute to non-wage aspects of work getting better or improving? And so really it's a combination of these 3 inputs. How much, do higher paying firms have higher or lower job satisfaction? How much do workers value that in terms of dollars, right? So that I can compare with wages. And then third, what fraction of that satisfaction premium can I attribute to these non-wage aspects of work improving or worsening? And so in the paper, I go through all 3 of those steps, but since this is a panel on text analysis, I figure I'll focus mostly on that. And so let me go right into what this data sort of looks like. Here's an example of a negative review, which discusses many job amenities. This is a 2-star review for the University of Minnesota. I don't have anything against the University of Minnesota. One of my previous co-authors picked this one and I've just been using it ever since. But here we see a 2-star review on the website Glassdoor, where workers not only say that they're poorly satisfied, they have a 2-star rating out of 5, but we see if we look at the text of this review, there's actually a lot of things being discussed within this review. So that 2 stars is really masking some positive aspects in job stability, potentially some reputation that looks great on a resume. But when we look at the cons, there's a lot of different aspects being discussed. We see below market pay, bureaucracy, politics, poor culture, management issues, poor leadership. So within that, there's a lot of amenities that are actually low quality at this employer for this worker who's leaving that review. And what I'm going to do in this paper is really try to extract exactly those amenities that are being discussed and try and measure them across employers. So for this same worker who's at multiple employers, how does their diction or how does their discussion of these amenities change as they work at these different employers? Does management become a more pro at this other firm? Do coworkers become more negative, etc.? And so what I'll do, and this took me a very long time, was figuring out 50 hard to measure attributes from text. So as Peter sort of highlighted, there is this sort of give and take where the researcher has to try and make sure that if you want interpretability, that there's some time that goes into making sure that the output that you get really can be interpreted as the labels that you put on it. So what I believe I capture is 50 hard to measure sort of amenities or attributes from this text. And really what I'm going to allow workers to do is describe for me or the econometrician what matters to them, right? So workers are going to detail positive and negative aspects of their work in those pros and cons sections. And that free response nature, right? Workers can talk about whatever they want to, allows me as the researcher to figure out what do workers actually value in their jobs. And so this led me to a comprehensive or exhaustive bundle of about 50 amenities. And what I'll do is a semi-supervised topic modeling approach called anchored correlation explanation. There's more details about it in the paper, but it's very useful for the task I have in mind, which is that it allows the researcher to extract very nuanced or very minutely discussed amenities. So even if diversity and inclusion isn't mentioned that often, some subset of workers might really value that. And so this allows me to capture amenities that might be hard to capture from general other language processing mechanisms. And so conveniently as the researcher, right, because I have those pros and those cons sections, it's already delineated for me whether or not this is positive at the employer or negative at that employer. And so for each worker or each review, what I can get is sort of the quality of that amenity. So do workers discuss this in the pros, in which case this is high quality? Or do workers talk about this in the cons, in which case this is low quality? And so for each worker, now in their reviews, I have, is this a positive amenity or a negative or low quality amenity. And I observed that workers saying these things for multiple employers. And so using that 8KM model, I can get firm specific differences in the quality of each of these 50 amenities. And what do I mean by amenities? Let me show you a couple of examples, right? And these are going to be, again, hard to measure amenities. So let me start with pay, which is typically not that hard to measure. Most data sets have earnings, right? Is I anchor it with semi-supervised approach where I say, I want words that look like pay, salary, base, money. It fills in, or the machine will fill in the rest of that topic. We see things like competitive, quite low, ridiculously low, make ton, disparity, lowball, peanuts. We see workers talking about pay or their satisfaction with pay. We can go into more hard to measure aspects like coworkers, right? So if I tell the machine I want something that looks like coworkers or friends or colleagues, it fills in things like become close, meet awesome, generally nice, good, hardworking, meet wonderful. So again, workers talking about the quality of their coworkers. Again, getting into this hard to measure aspect, something like short breaks, which you just wouldn't see in other data sets. Right here, I can anchor it words like break or rest or bathroom or lunch. And we see workers talking about these short breaks. We see take lunch, half hour, 2 minute, use bathroom, get break or break time. So again, hard to measure aspects that are sort of evoked are coming out through this textual analysis algorithm. And the last one I'll show you is just autonomy or responsibility. Again, this hard to measure aspect of work. If I say I want something that looks like autonomy, independence, responsibility, I get words like shirk, minimal supervision, lots of freedom, variety of tasks. Again, something that looks like autonomy or responsibility. And so, let me just conclude with the last 20 seconds I have in this 10-minute session, which is that what I'll ultimately find is that wages, in fact, understate inequality across firms. That high-paying jobs are also good jobs, right? That higher-paying firms offer higher satisfaction, right? And they're going to do that because they offer better non-wage amenities. And this is pretty exhaustive. We see improved working conditions, interpersonal relationships, more investment in human capital development. The lone exception here is that higher paying firms tend to have worse job security. We see workers talking more about job insecurity at higher paying firms. But when we incorporate these amenities, we see that the variance in compensation across employers actually raises by at least 50%. And so I think there's a lot of important implications here, right? About, can this explain why high wage workers sort into high paying firms, right? Is this a strategic decision of retention, right? Are amenities a way of locking people into their jobs? But I'll leave that for potentially Q&A or further discussion. Thanks so much.
Awesome, thanks, Jason. So we've got just a few minutes, but I'll kick it off. One thing I was wondering, as also a user of the Glassdoor data, so this is like a friendly question I've struggled with, is just like, how you think about salience and like stuff that's not mentioned at all. Like, it's not like a survey where everybody has to say whether they're happy with job insecurity or not. Most people just don't mention it at all. How do you think about that in studying this?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's something I did think quite a lot about, especially when getting into the sort of interview stages of the job market and everything. But the way I thought about it was, in terms of the way I'm modeling this or identifying amenity quality, it actually doesn't matter if the worker doesn't mention it in a review. All that matters is that they mention it at least once, right? Is that I need some identifying variation from, between reviews. So as long as I have the same worker leaving multiple reviews, the fact that they mention something or mention it once in this review, but not here, tells me something about a quality change, right? So in that sense, I think it's okay for this type of analysis. But if you were going to look at a cross-section of workers where it's there or it's not, the way I've tried to think about this with my other coworkers or co-authors is that, the absence of a discussion sort of means that it's neutral, right? It's not evoking enough emotion to say this is super positive or super negative. So there, you can get into sort of expectations that the worker has about the job. But I think in this setting, I don't think that matters too much for my identification.
Thanks. Other questions for Jason? Super interesting work.
I'll jump in. I was wondering, Jason, if you've had the opportunity to run experiments with Glassdoor like this on this particular line that you've just articulated, right? So could you randomize what falls into an example in terms of a pro and con, just from an A/B testing perspective, to get some elicitation of what amenities workers might talk about?
Yeah, so I will nip that in the bud. I have not, and I don't think I ever will be. I think,
okay.
The fact that it's $1 billion company, I don't think they're going to let me do outside A/B testing on it. They do let me access the data, which I'm very thankful for. But in terms of identifying whether that's a pro or a con, I think workers delineating that for me actually saved me a lot of effort, right? If there was no pros or cons text and there was just one text box, I think this would be a very difficult project, right? Because then I'd have to, as the researcher, import my own sentiment of, hey, they use this word, but then you get the question in the audience of what if the word not is before it and it inverts everything you just did? Well, I don't have that problem here, right? I'm sure, you know, we've all faced that kind of question using text data, but thankfully with the pros and the cons, I think I can sort of assume this is a positive and a negative assortment.
I
thanks, Sarah.
believe that. Yeah, I believe that your contributions could be worth billions of dollars too.
Sorry, I'm going to add that quote to my website. If I could just get that in writing, that'd be great in an email.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. And thanks, everyone. Super interesting panel. And hopefully the audience is energized about the many possibilities of text analysis for studying labor and employment issues. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, Nate, for putting this together.
Yeah, thanks, Nate.
Sure. Thanks so much.